Everyone laughed at the farmer's rusty safe. But what he found inside stopped the town. William Thompson dragged the heavy safe along the cobblestone sidewalk while neighbors leaned out their windows, whispering and shaking their heads in disapproval. The 72-year-old man, with completely white hair and a thin beard, wore his usual brown plaid shirt and blue jeans with orange suspenders that he'd worn for decades. The rusty safe he struggled to carry had become a joke in the small town of Riverbend in rural Kentucky. For 3 weeks, William had insisted he needed to open that safe in front of the entire community, claiming its contents would forever change the lives of all the residents. His 45-year-old daughter, Rebecca, followed behind, her face red with embarrassment. She had tried to convince her father to give up this madness, but William grew more stubborn with each passing day. "Dad, for heaven's sake, let's go home," whispered Rebecca, looking around as more people came out of their houses to watch the spectacle. "You're making a fool of yourself in front of everyone." "Rebecca, my dear, I've told you I won't stop until I manage to open this safe right here in the square for everyone to see," replied William, breathless from the effort. "There's something important in here, something that's going to affect a lot of people." Mrs. Patterson, the street's biggest gossip, appeared in her doorway with her arms crossed. "William, you've completely lost your mind. This old safe has nothing but rust and termites," she shouted so the whole neighborhood could hear. "Stop this foolishness before the mayor comes to get you." "Say what you want, Gladys," William retorted, stopping to catch his breath. "But when I open this safe, you'll have to eat your words." The sound of metal scraping on the ground echoed through the narrow streets of the historic center. William had found the safe buried in his farmyard 2 months ago while building a new chicken coop. The object was covered in decades of dirt and rust, but something about it had caught the farmer's attention. Since then, William had spent his afternoons trying to figure out how to open the safe. He had taken it to several locksmiths in the area, but none could make a key that worked. The internal mechanism seemed locked up from years of neglect and rust. Rebecca tried once more to convince her father to go home. "Dad, you're embarrassing our whole family. The entire town is saying you've finally gone crazy," she said, lowering her voice when she noticed Mr. Joe, the bakery owner, had also come out to watch. "Please, let's forget this safe and get on with our lives in peace." "Rebecca, you don't understand," replied William, wiping the sweat from his brow with his shirt sleeve. "Your mother visited me in a dream 3 nights ago. She told me exactly where to find the key to this safe." Rebecca sighed deeply. Since her mother had passed away the previous year, her father had started behaving strangely, always claiming he received messages from her in his dreams. His daughter attributed it to grief and loneliness, but she never imagined it would get to the point of him dragging a rusty safe all over town. "Mr. Thompson, with all due respect, but you need medical help," said Mr. Joe, approaching the group. "This isn't normal behavior for a man your age." "Normal?" William stopped and stared at the baker. "Jack, how many years have you known this town? 40? 50? Then you know perfectly well there have always been secrets around here. Secrets that some people preferred to bury, just like this safe." The baker shook his head and went back inside his shop, muttering something about troubled folks. William continued dragging the safe, determined to reach the central square. The path from his house to the square wasn't long, but the weight of the safe and the growing curiosity of the residents made every meter a battle. When they finally arrived at Veterans Square, in the heart of town, a small crowd was already waiting. The news that the old farmer was dragging a safe through the streets had spread quickly, and people had started to gather to watch what promised to be an unusual spectacle. "Looks like everyone's here to see William's circus," commented Mrs. Henderson, a 68-year-old retiree who lived across from the square. "Poor thing, old age has come and taken his mind with it." "Don't be mean, Betty," scolded Mrs. Wilson, her neighbor of decades. "The man lost his wife not long ago. He must be suffering terribly and making up these stories to deal with the pain." William Thompson positioned the safe in the center of the square, under the old fig tree that had shaded the spot for more than a century. His hands were shaking, not just from the physical effort, but from the emotion of finally being able to fulfill what he considered a promise made to his late wife. Rebecca stood apart, talking in whispers with other townswomen who had come to watch. She hoped it would all be over soon so she could take her father back home. "Folks, you can come closer," announced William, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You're going to witness something very important today." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The small crowd approached cautiously, some laughing softly, others expressing genuine concern for the farmer's mental state. Children ran home to get their parents, and within minutes the square was more crowded than during the 4th of July festivities. William took a small, rusty key from his shirt pocket, as old and oxidized as the safe itself. "My Grace, God rest her soul, told me exactly where to find this key," he explained, showing the object for all to see. It was buried under the guava tree, in the same spot where she used to sit and crochet on Sunday afternoons. "Dad, please," murmured Rebecca, mortified by the situation. "Let's go home. You can try to open that safe there, away from everyone's eyes." "No, daughter," William replied firmly. "Your mother was very specific. She said I had to open it here, in front of the whole community, because what's inside affects a lot of people, not just our family." Mayor Richard Hamilton, a 55-year-old man always impeccably dressed, arrived at the square with hurried steps after being told about the commotion. "Mr. Thompson, what is all this mess?" asked the mayor, trying to keep a respectful tone but clearly irritated. "You are disturbing the public order. I must ask you to leave immediately." "Richard, you've known me for decades," replied William, holding the key firmly. "I have never caused trouble for anyone in this town. I've always been a hard-working and respectful man. If I'm here today, it's because I need to be." "Mr. Thompson, with all due respect, but you can't just occupy the public square with your fantasies," said the mayor, looking around and noticing that more and more people were joining the group. "If you don't leave here willingly, I'll have to call the municipal guards." "Call whoever you want, Richard," William retorted, kneeling beside the safe. "But before you take me away, give me 5 minutes to open this. 5 minutes is all I ask." Mrs. Wilson, who had known William since he was a child, approached and put her hand on the mayor's shoulder. "Richard, let the man try to open that safe. What's the worst that could happen? If there's nothing important in it, he'll quiet down and leave." "But if there is, at least we find out once and for all." The mayor sighed, realizing there were more than 50 people in the square waiting for a decision. It would be easier to let William try to open the safe and be done with this story. "All right, Mr. William," Richard Hamilton conceded. 5 minutes. But if you can't open it, or if there's nothing important inside, you're coming with me for a serious talk about disturbing the peace." William Thompson nodded and focused on the safe's lock. The key was small and seemed fragile, but it fit perfectly into the mechanism. The farmer turned it slowly, feeling the resistance from years of rust and neglect. A soft click, almost imperceptible, echoed in the silence of the square. William tried to lift the lid, but it resisted. He applied more force, and finally the safe opened with a metallic creak that made some children hide behind their parents. The inside of the safe was lined with a cloth yellowed by time. William carefully removed the covering, revealing old papers, photographs, and some small objects that glinted faintly in the sunlight. A murmur ran through the crowd when William held up the first photograph. It was a black-and-white image, clearly old, showing a girl of about 8 years old playing in a well-kept garden. "Who is that child?" asked Mrs. Henderson, trying to see the photo better. William examined the image more closely and then looked at the crowd with a grave expression. "Folks, you need to see this," he said, showing the photograph to everyone. "This is Emily Blackwell, daughter of the late Colonel Blackwell and Mrs. Blackwell." An absolute silence fell over the square. Everyone knew the story of the Blackwell family, one of the richest and most influential in the region until the 1980s. The couple's only daughter, Emily, had mysteriously disappeared when she was 8 years old, back in 1982. But that's not possible," murmured Richard Hamilton, taking the photograph from William's hands. "Emily disappeared over 40 years ago. How did this photo end up in a safe buried in your backyard?" William didn't answer immediately. Instead, he continued taking items out of the safe, more photographs, yellowed letters, certificates, and documents that looked very old. Rebecca, who had moved closer out of curiosity, recognized one of the photographs and turned pale. "Dad, that's me," she said, her voice trembling, pointing to a photo showing a girl playing on the farm. "But I was wearing the dress you always said was your favorite outfit of mine when I was little." "Rebecca," William began, but his voice failed him. Mrs. Patterson, who had arrived at the square a few minutes earlier, came closer to get a better look at the photos. "Good heavens," she exclaimed, bringing her hand to her mouth. "Rebecca, you look exactly like the Blackwell girl in this old photo. It's as if they were the same person, just wearing different clothes." The mayor took the two photographs and compared them side by side. The resemblance was undeniable and disturbing. The facial structure, the eyes, the shape of the smile, everything indicated they could be the same child photographed at different times. "Mr. William, you need to explain to me what is going on here," said Richard Hamilton, in a much more serious tone than before. "This situation is getting very strange." William was silent for a few seconds, looking alternately at Rebecca and the people gathered in the square. His hands trembled as he held the documents taken from the safe. "Folks, I'm going to tell a story that I've kept for over 40 years, he said finally, his voice choked with emotion. "A story that my late wife made me promise I would take to the grave. But she herself, in a dream, told me the time for the truth has come." The crowd moved in even closer, forming a tight circle around William and the open safe. Even the children stopped playing and were paying attention to the adults' conversation. "It was December of 1982, began William, looking at the ground. "I was coming back to town by truck alone after selling some head of cattle. It was almost midnight when I saw a small figure walking alone on the dirt road." Rebecca sat down on a bench in the square, sensing that her life was about to change forever. "When I got closer, I saw it was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old," continued William. "She was barefoot, her clothes were torn, and she was crying hard. I stopped the truck and asked what she was doing there alone in the middle of the night." "Dad, what story is this?" interrupted Rebecca, her voice full of anguish. "Why did you never tell me this?" "Because your mother and I decided to protect you, daughter," replied William, wiping a tear that ran down his face. "The girl I found on the road said her name was Emily, that she had run away from home because she couldn't take the beatings from her father anymore." A murmur of shock went through the crowd. Mrs. Wilson made the sign of the cross, and several people began whispering among themselves, trying to process what they were hearing. "But Colonel Blackwell was a respected man," exclaimed Mrs. Henderson. "What do you mean the girl ran away because she was beaten?" "Respected by those who didn't know what happened inside his house," retorted William, bitterness in his voice. "The girl was covered in bruises. She had rope marks on her wrists. She said her father locked her in the basement when he drank, and that her mother never defended her." Rebecca got up from the bench and walked over to her father, her legs weak. "Dad, are you saying that I am Emily Blackwell?" she asked, her voice almost inaudible. "You are my daughter, Rebecca," replied William, hugging her tightly. "It doesn't matter how you came to us. You are and always will be my daughter. But yes, you were born Emily Blackwell." The mayor approached, holding the documents he had taken from the safe. "Mr. Thompson, if this is true, you committed a serious crime," said Richard, examining the certificates. "Concealment of a missing minor, kidnapping—" "Kidnapping?" William turned to the mayor, his eyes flashing with anger. "I saved a child who was being tortured. If that's a crime, then I'll sign my name to it with pride." Mrs. Wilson approached Rebecca, who was crying silently. "My dear, do you remember anything from that time?" the lady asked kindly. "Any memories of the house you lived in before?" Rebecca shook her head, wiping her tears with her sleeve. I always dreamed of a dark basement," she said, hesitantly. "Nightmares about a man shouting and a woman crying, but I thought it was just a bad memory from some movie I saw on television when I was little." "It wasn't a movie, daughter," said William sadly. "It was your mind trying to forget the traumas you lived through before you came to us." The mayor continued examining the documents, trying to understand the legal situation of it all. "There's more here," announced Richard, holding up a series of handwritten letters. "They seem to be letters you wrote to someone." William nodded gravely. For 2 years, my wife and I wrote letters to the Blackwells trying to return Emily, he revealed. We sent them through intermediaries, trusted people who knew the situation. And what happened to those letters? Asked the mayor. They all came back unanswered, along with threats, replied William. Colonel Blackwell sent word that if we showed up with the girl, he would make sure we never left his property alive. Rebecca approached the safe and picked up one of the letters, recognizing her late adoptive mother's handwriting. Colonel Blackwell, we found your daughter Emily on the road, hurt and very afraid, she read aloud. The girl is well cared for with us, but we know her place is with her true parents. Please contact us to arrange the return of your daughter. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like the video, and especially to subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. And what was the response, Anne? Asked Mrs. Patterson, clearly moved by the situation. William Thompson searched through the papers and found a yellowed envelope with the Blackwell family crest. This was the first response we received, he said, handing the letter to the mayor to read aloud. Richard Hamilton opened the envelope carefully and read, "To the vagrants who have my daughter, if you show up around here or tell anyone anything, you'll find out what happens to people who meddle in Blackwell family affairs. The girl is officially missing and will stay that way. Do not contact me again." A heavy silence fell over the square. Even the children seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. "But didn't they do anything to look for their daughter?" asked Mrs. Henderson, outraged. "Didn't they call anyone, organize any searches?" "On the contrary," replied William, taking another document from the safe. "1 week after we found Emily, the regional newspaper reported that the girl had gotten lost during an outing at the farm and had probably been attacked by wild animals." Rebecca took the yellowed newspaper clipping her father handed her. The headline read, "Daughter of traditional rural family disappears on family property." The girl Emily Blackwell, aged 8, disappeared yesterday afternoon during a walk on the grounds of the family's rural property, read Rebecca, her voice trembling. According to the parents, the child often played alone near the woods. Searches were conducted, but no traces were found. The family asks for prayers and considers the possibility that the girl got lost in the forest. "All lies," said William, shaking his head. "Emily never got lost in the woods. She ran away from home because she couldn't take the abuse anymore and walked all night until I found her on the road." The mayor continued examining the documents, growing more and more intrigued by the amount of evidence William had kept for decades. "There's more here," announced Richard Hamilton, holding up a folder full of papers. "These seem to be medical reports." "My wife was a retired nurse," explained William. "When we brought Emily home, she gave the girl a full examination and documented all the injuries." Rebecca approached, curious, and at the same time afraid of what she might discover. "May I see?" she asked. William hesitated for a moment, then handed the reports to his daughter. "Daughter, prepare yourself. It won't be easy to read this." Rebecca opened the folder and immediately turned pale upon seeing Mrs. Grace's detailed notes about her physical condition when she arrived at the farm. "Child presents multiple bruises on arms, legs, and back," she read, her voice breaking. "Circular marks on wrists, consistent with prolonged binding. Signs of malnutrition and dehydration. Child demonstrates extreme terror upon hearing loud male voices." The women present in the square began to cry silently. Mrs. Wilson approached Rebecca and hugged her. "My dear, you were saved by angels," said the elderly lady. "William and Grace gave you a new life." Rebecca continued reading the medical reports, discovering shocking details about her own childhood that she had completely forgotten. "The child reports being locked in the basement when she misbehaved," she read, tears streaming down her face. "Says her father hit her with a belt when he drank, and that her mother never tried to protect her. The girl has constant night terrors and recurring nightmares." William approached his daughter and put his hand on her shoulder. "That's why your mother and I decided never to tell you the truth," he said affectionately. "You were a traumatized child who had forgotten the horrors you lived through. We didn't want you to remember any of that." "But did you know her biological parents were alive?" asked the mayor. "Did you know they continued living here in the region?" "Of course we knew," replied William. Colonel Blackwell continued with his normal life, as if nothing had happened. His wife was never seen in public again after Emily's disappearance. Mrs. Henderson, who was older and remembered that time well, approached the group. "Now that you mention it, I do remember that Mrs. Margaret Blackwell really dropped out of sight after 1982, she said thoughtfully. "I never saw her in town again at church anywhere." "She went mad with remorse," revealed William. "Some people who worked at the Blackwell house at the time told me she spent her days locked in her room, crying and screaming her daughter's name." Rebecca closed the folder of medical reports, unable to continue reading about the trauma she suffered as a child. "Dad, what happened to them?" she asked. "Are the Blackwells still alive?" William took another envelope from the safe, this one much newer than the others. "Colonel Blackwell passed away 5 years ago from cirrhosis of the liver," he informed her. "Mrs. Margaret has been in a psychiatric clinic in Louisville for over 20 years. "How do you know this?" asked the mayor, surprised by the precision of the information. "Because I never stopped keeping track of their situation," replied William. "I always knew that one day the truth would need to come out, and I wanted to make sure you were all prepared." Rebecca walked over to the park bench and sat down, trying to process all the information she had received in the last few minutes. Her entire life had been a lie, or at least a heavily edited version of reality. "Dad, do you have any more secrets hidden in that safe?" she asked, with a mix of sadness and irritation in her voice. William took the last item from the safe, a sealed envelope with the name Rebecca written by hand. "This is for you," he said, handing the envelope to his daughter. "Your mother wrote it shortly before she passed away. She said you should only read it when you knew the whole truth." Rebecca took the envelope with trembling hands and opened it carefully. It was a letter several pages long, written in the delicate handwriting she knew so well. "My dearest Rebecca," she began to read aloud, "if you are reading this letter, it means your father has finally found the courage to tell you the whole truth about how you came to us." The crowd moved in even closer, fascinated by the story unfolding before their eyes. "I want you to know that from the very first moment we saw you on that road, crying and hurt, we knew God had placed you in our lives for a special reason," continued Rebecca, her voice choked with emotion. "Your father and I tried for 2 years to return you to your biological parents, but they wanted nothing to do with you. They preferred to pretend you had disappeared forever than to admit you had run away because of the mistreatment." Mrs. Wilson wiped her eyes with a handkerchief, moved by the revelation. "Rebecca, you need to understand that we did not steal you from your family," read Rebecca, pausing to control her emotion. "It was your family that abandoned you. We merely offered you the love and care that every child deserves." The mayor approached William with a much more respectful expression than at the start of the conversation. "Mr. Thompson, I apologize for how I reacted initially," said Richard Hamilton. "I had no idea of the complexity of this situation." "No need to apologize, Richard," replied William. "I understand it seemed crazy when I started talking about opening the safe in front of everyone." Rebecca folded her mother's letter and carefully put it away in her purse. "Father, there's something I didn't understand," she said. "If you kept all these documents for 40 years, why did you decide to reveal everything now?" William looked up at the sky, as if he were silently talking to his late wife. "Because there are people in this town who still don't know the whole truth about the Blackwell family," he answered mysteriously. "And because you have rights you never claimed." "Rights? What rights?" asked Rebecca, confused. The mayor, who had continued examining the documents from the safe, held up a very serious-looking official paper. "Mr. Thompson, this document here, is it a death certificate?" asked Richard Hamilton with a furrowed brow. "For Emily Blackwell, yes," confirmed William. "Issued 3 months after her supposed disappearance, so the family could collect the girl's life insurance." A murmur of shock and indignation ran through the crowd. "You mean they declared their daughter dead to collect insurance money?" asked Mrs. Henderson, horrified. "Exactly," replied William. "And the amount wasn't small. According to my information, it was $500,000 in the money of the time." Rebecca stood up from the bench, visibly shaken. "Father, are you telling me that my biological parents preferred to write me off for money than to look for me?" she asked, her voice full of pain. Rebecca, they were never your real parents, answered William firmly. Real parents don't do that to their children. Your real parents were me and your mother, who loved you from the very first day. Mrs. Patterson, who had remained quiet for most of the revelation, approached the group. William, I need to confess something, she said, her voice hesitant. I worked as a maid in the Blackwell house for a few months in 1982. I left there just before Emily disappeared. Everyone turned to look at the woman, curious about what she had to add to the story. And what did you see there, Gladys? Asked the mayor. Horrible things, she answered, shaking her head. Colonel Blackwell drank heavily and became violent. Several times I saw him hit the girl for insignificant things. Once she spilled a glass of milk on the floor, and he locked her in the basement all day without food or water. Rebecca approached Mrs. Patterson, eager for more information about her past. And my mother. I mean, Mrs. Blackwell. Did she try to protect me? Asked Rebecca. Gladys sighed deeply before answering. Mrs. Blackwell lived in fear of her husband. When he drank and became violent, she would lock herself in the bedroom and leave the girl alone to deal with his fury. She never tried to protect you, Rebecca. Not once. Why did you never tell anyone about this? Asked Mrs. Wilson, outraged. Because back then no one interfered in the Blackwell family's affairs, replied Gladys bitterly. They were powerful, had important connections. Anyone who spoke ill of them could lose their job, their home, even be run out of town. The mayor continued examining the documents, increasingly impressed with the amount of evidence William had collected over the years. There's more here that you all need to know, announced Richard Hamilton, holding up a folder full of receipts and proofs of payment. William, did you document all the expenses you had raising Rebecca? Every penny, confirmed the farmer. Clothes, food, medicine, school, everything. My wife insisted that we do it, in case we ever needed to prove that we took good care of the girl. Rebecca flipped through the receipts, moved to see decades of love transformed into numbers and papers. Father, you spent a fortune on me, she said, mentally calculating the amounts. How did you pay for all this with the farm's income? Your mother took in sewing, I did extra work, replied William simply. But for us, it wasn't a sacrifice. It was love. Mrs. Henderson, who had witnessed the entire revelation, approached Rebecca with a thoughtful expression. Rebecca, dear, did you know you have the right to claim the Blackwell's inheritance? She asked. After all, you are the couple's only child. Rebecca looked at the woman in surprise. Inheritance? But I'm not officially their daughter. According to the documents, Emily Blackwell is deceased. The mayor interjected into the conversation, still holding the papers from the safe. Actually, Rebecca, this situation is much more complex than it seems, said Richard Hamilton. If we can prove that you are Emily Blackwell and that your death certificate was fraudulent, you would indeed have the right to claim the inheritance. And what would the value of that inheritance be? Asked Mrs. Wilson, curious. William searched among the documents and found a property appraisal he had done a few years prior. According to my research, the Blackwell property is worth approximately $2 million today, he informed. Besides that, they had investments and a considerable bank account. Rebecca sat back down on the bench, clearly overwhelmed by all the information. Father, I don't want their money, she said firmly. They abandoned me. They preferred to pretend I was lost rather than look for me. Why would I want anything that was theirs? Because it's not about them, daughter, replied William, sitting beside Rebecca. It's about justice. They caused you terrible trauma, abandoned you, and even profited from it. You have the right to reclaim what was always rightfully yours. Mrs. Patterson approached the bench where father and daughter were talking. Rebecca, may I suggest something? She said hesitantly. If you get this inheritance, you could use the money to help other children going through the same situation you went through. Rebecca's eyes lit up with the idea. You're right, Mrs. Patterson, she said, standing up. If I can prove my identity and receive this inheritance, I will turn the Blackwell property into a safe place for children who suffer abuse. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out now continuing. The crowd reacted positively to the idea, with many people agreeing it would be a just way to use the money from the family that had caused so much suffering. But how will we prove that Rebecca is really Emily? Asked the mayor. After 40 years, It must be complicated to gather enough evidence. William smiled for the first time since he had opened the safe. Richard, I said I saved everything, and that's exactly what I meant, he replied, picking up a small envelope from the bottom of the safe. When we found Emily, my wife cut a lock of her hair and saved it, along with the clothes she was wearing the night she ran away. What is that for? Asked Rebecca, confused. DNA, replied the mayor, immediately understanding where William was going. With a hair sample from 1982 and a current sample from you, we can scientifically prove that you are the same person. And I still have contacts for people who worked at the Blackwell house back then, added William. Several of them are still alive and can testify about the abuse Emily suffered. Mrs. Patterson offered immediately. I will testify, she said with determination. I'm tired of carrying this weight on my conscience. I should have reported Colonel Blackwell back then, but I was afraid. Now is my chance to do the right thing. Other people in the crowd began to remember details from that time and offered to help. I remember seeing Emily several times in town with bruises on her face, said old Joe, the baker. I always thought it was strange, but nobody said anything. The school nurse mentioned that the girl always arrived with new injuries, added Mrs. Henderson. But back then people didn't question important families. Rebecca looked at all those people offering help and felt a different emotion. It was no longer the shame or confusion from the beginning, but a feeling of belonging and community support. Father, how did you know people would react like this? She asked. How were you so sure they would accept me and want to help? Because I know the heart of the people in this town, answered William, looking at the crowd with affection. They are good, Rebecca. They just needed to know the truth to be able to act justly. The mayor approached Rebecca with a serious but friendly expression. Rebecca, if you really want to move forward with this, I can put you in touch with lawyers who specialize in restitution cases, offered Richard Hamilton. The city will support your cause. Why would you do that? Asked Rebecca, surprised by the mayor's change in attitude. Because justice is justice, he replied simply, and because a property turned into a shelter for children would be much better for our town than leaving everything abandoned as it is today. Rebecca looked at her father, who nodded encouragingly. All right, she said, making a decision. Let's move forward. I will fight for my rights, not for the money, but for the chance to turn a place of suffering into a place of hope. The crowd applauded Rebecca's decision, and several people approached to offer support and help with the process. William closed the empty safe and stood up, feeling an enormous weight being lifted from his shoulders. Folks, I want to thank you all for your understanding, he said, his voice emotional. I carried this secret for 40 years, and today I can finally sleep in peace knowing I did the right thing. Mrs. Wilson approached William and Rebecca and hugged them. You two are examples of true love, she said, with tears in her eyes. William and Grace saved a child and turned her into a wonderful woman. That's what matters. In the days following the revelation in the square, the town of Riverbend was buzzing with the story of Rebecca and William. The news spread quickly to neighboring towns, and soon journalists began arriving to document the case. Rebecca, with the mayor's support, sought out a lawyer specializing in inheritance law in the state capital. The professional, Dr. Michael Johnson, was immediately interested in the case when he learned the details. Rebecca, this is one of the most complex and interesting cases I have seen in my 30-year career, said the lawyer, examining all the documents William had kept. We have enough evidence to prove fraud in the death certificate and family negligence. How long could this process take? Asked Rebecca, eager to start the shelter project. With all this documentation and the available witnesses, I believe we can get a preliminary decision in 6 months, replied Dr. Johnson. The most important thing is that you have the support of the local community. That helps a lot in cases like this. Meanwhile, William began receiving daily visitors at his farm, people who wanted to meet the man who had kept a secret for decades to protect his adopted daughter. One morning, 3 weeks after the revelation, Rebecca arrived at her father's farm with important news. Dad, you're not going to believe this, she said, her eyes shining with emotion. Dr. Johnson managed to locate Colonel Blackwell's first wife. William stopped feeding the chickens and looked at his daughter with surprise. What do you mean, first wife? I thought Mrs. Blackwell was the only one." "I thought so too," replied Rebecca, sitting on the house's porch. "But apparently Colonel Blackwell was married before, between 1975 and 1978, to a woman named Catherine Reynolds." "And what happened to her?" Rebecca picked up a folder she had brought and showed some documents to her father. "She filed for divorce, citing domestic violence," explained Rebecca. "And get this, in the divorce papers, she mentions that Colonel Blackwell also abused the son they had together." William turned pale upon hearing the information. "Rebecca, does this mean you had a half-brother?" "I did," she replied with sadness. "The boy's name was David, and according to the divorce documents, he was only 5 years old when his mother managed to escape with him." "And where are they now?" "Dr. Johnson managed to track down Catherine Reynolds," said Rebecca, taking a deep breath. "She lives in New York City and works as a retired teacher. David graduated from medical school and has a clinic in the countryside of New York State." William sat down next to his daughter, realizing the story was becoming even more complex. "Have you spoken to them yet?" "Not yet," replied Rebecca. "But Dr. Johnson believes they could be important witnesses in our case. If David also suffered abuse from Colonel Blackwell, it strengthens our version of the facts." "And do you want to meet them?" Rebecca was quiet for a few minutes, looking at the landscape of the farm where she had grown up. "Dad, I'm scared," she finally admitted. "What if they don't believe my story? What if they think I'm lying to get the inheritance?" "Rebecca, my dear, the truth always comes out," replied William, taking his daughter's hand. "If they went through the same thing you did, they will understand your situation perfectly." 3 days later, Rebecca received an unexpected phone call. It was David Reynolds, the half-brother she never knew existed. "Rebecca," said a male voice on the other end of the line, "my name is David. I believe we are siblings." Rebecca felt her heart race. "David, did Dr. Johnson speak with you?" "Yes, he did," he replied. "And I need to tell you something. My mother and I never believed you got lost in the woods. We always suspected you had run away because of the abuse. You knew about the mistreatment." "Rebecca, when my mother managed to divorce Colonel Blackwell in 1978, she tried to report the abuse I suffered," explained David. "But no one believed her. They said she was making things up to damage her ex-husband." Rebecca began to cry, moved to discover she was not alone in that situation. "David, do you remember what he was like?" "I remember everything," replied the half-brother, his voice filled with emotion. "The nighttime terror, the screaming, the beatings. My mother took me away from there when I was 5, but I never forgot." "And would you like to meet me?" "Rebecca, my mother is 78 years old and has always blamed herself for not being able to save you too," said David. "Meeting you would be the fulfillment of a 40-year dream for her." 1 week later, Rebecca and William traveled to New York City to meet Catherine and David. The meeting took place in the simple house where Catherine had lived for decades, a stark contrast to the wealth she had left behind when she divorced Colonel Blackwell. When Rebecca and Catherine saw each other for the first time, it was as if time had stood still. The elderly lady immediately recognized the features of the girl she had tried to protect so many years before. "Emily." "My dear Emily," said Catherine, embracing Rebecca and crying, "I thought I would never see you again." "Why did you never try to find me after the divorce?" asked Rebecca, also emotional. "I did try," replied Catherine, drying her tears, "but Colonel Blackwell got a court order forbidding me from approaching the property or contacting you. He said I was a bad influence on his daughter." David, who was watching the encounter between his mother and his half-sister, approached William Thompson. "Mr. Thompson, on behalf of my family, I want to thank you for everything you did for Emily," said the doctor, extending his hand. "You saved her from a terrible fate." "I did what any decent person would do," replied William, shaking the young man's hand. "Rebecca is my daughter, no matter how she came to me." During the conversation, Catherine revealed shocking details about Colonel Blackwell's personality that no one knew. "He wasn't just violent," she explained, serving coffee for everyone. "He was manipulative and calculating. When he found out I wanted a divorce, he threatened to harm my family, if I said anything about the abuse. "And how did you manage to leave there with David?" asked Rebecca. "I fled in the middle of the night, just like you did," replied Catherine. "I left everything behind and came to New York City with just the clothes on my back. I worked as a housekeeper for years to support David and pay for his studies." David interjected into the conversation. "Rebecca, my mother wants to tell you something about Colonel Blackwell's second wife," he said, looking meaningfully at Catherine. "What would that be?" Catherine hesitated for a moment, then sighed deeply. Rebecca. Margaret was not an innocent victim like everyone thinks," she revealed. "She knew exactly how her husband treated you, and she never did anything to stop it." "What do you mean?" "Before I divorced him, I tried to talk to Margaret several times," explained Catherine. "I told her that Colonel Blackwell was going to do the same thing to you that he did to me and David." She replied that she didn't care as long as he left her alone. Rebecca felt an anger she had never experienced before. "She chose to sacrifice me to protect herself." "Exactly," confirmed Catherine. "Margaret was cowardly and selfish. When you disappeared, she pretended to be devastated. But she was actually relieved that she no longer had to witness his abuse." William, who had remained quiet for most of the conversation, interjected. "Catherine, do you have any proof of what you're saying?" "I do," she replied, getting up and going to fetch a box from another room. "I kept all the letters I exchanged with people who worked at the house during the 1980s. Catherine returned with a box full of correspondence and showed several letters that detailed Margaret's behavior regarding the mistreatment Rebecca suffered. "This letter is from the cook," said Catherine, showing a yellowed sheet. "Mrs. Reynolds, the situation with the girl Emily is getting worse. Yesterday the colonel locked her in the basement again, and Mrs. Blackwell told the maids to pretend they weren't hearing the screams." Rebecca took the letter and read the rest of the content, growing increasingly outraged by the discovery. The girl asked her mother for help when her father was hitting her with the belt, but Mrs. Blackwell left the room and locked herself in her bedroom. Later, she told the girl to stop crying because it was giving her a headache. "Rebecca, that woman was never your mother," said David, anger in his voice. "A real mother would die before letting anyone hurt her child." Catherine showed more letters, all reporting similar situations where Margaret deliberately ignored or enabled the abuse that Colonel Blackwell committed against Rebecca. "This one is from 1981, she said, picking up another letter. "Mrs. Blackwell sent the maids home early when she found out the Colonel was drunk and furious with Emily. She said she didn't want any witnesses to what was about to happen." Rebecca threw the cards on the table, unable to keep reading. "How is it possible that two people could be so cruel to a child?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Because they weren't normal people," replied David. "They were monsters hiding behind money and social status." William Thompson walked over to Rebecca and hugged her. "My dear, now you understand why your real mother and I never wanted you to remember the past," he said affectionately. "We wanted you to grow up knowing only what true love is." Catherine sat down next to Rebecca and took her hand. "Rebecca, I want to help you get the Blackwell inheritance," she said with determination. "Not for the money, but for justice. That property was built with blood and suffering. If you turn it into a place of hope for children, you'll be honoring all the victims of that family." "You would really do that for me?" asked Rebecca, moved. "Of course," replied Catherine. "You're the daughter I couldn't save back then. Now is my chance to do the right thing." David also offered to help. "Rebecca, as a doctor, I can attest to the psychological damage this kind of abuse causes in children," he said. "My testimony could be important in the legal process. And I have contacts in New York City who can help with donations and volunteering when you open the shelter," added Catherine. Rebecca looked at all these people offering help: William, David, Catherine, and the whole community of Riverbend that had promised support, and felt for the first time in her life that she truly belonged to a large, loving family. "Father, I think it's time for us to go home and get to work seriously on this project," she said, getting up from her chair. "We have a lot of work ahead of us." The legal process to restore Rebecca's rights as Emily Blackwell lasted exactly 5 months. With all the evidence collected by William over decades, the testimonies of Catherine, David, Gladys, and several other people, and the DNA tests that confirmed Rebecca's identity, the judge had no difficulty making his decision. One April morning, Rebecca received a call from Dr. Johnson with the news that would change her life forever. "Rebecca, we did it," said the lawyer enthusiastically. "The judge ruled in your favor on all counts. The fraudulent death certificate was annulled. You have been officially recognized as Emily Blackwell, sole heir to the estate of Colonel Blackwell and Margaret Blackwell." Rebecca sat on her father's porch, trying to process the information. "Dr. Johnson, what is the total value of the inheritance?" "Brace yourself," replied the lawyer. "Between the rural property, investments, bank accounts, and other assets, you have inherited approximately $2.8 million. "My God! And Rebecca, there's one more thing," added Dr. Johnson. "The judge also ruled that the Blackwell family must pay compensation for moral damages due to the mistreatment and abandonment. The amount was set at $500,000. "But they've already passed away. Their estate is liable for the debt," explained the lawyer, "which means you'll receive $500,000 more than was already calculated." Rebecca hung up the phone and sat in silence for a few minutes, contemplating the complete transformation her life had undergone in just a few months. William came home from work at the farm and found his daughter still sitting on the porch, looking at the horizon. "Rebecca, dear, did something happen?" he asked, worried by his daughter's thoughtful expression. "Father, we won," she said simply. "We won everything, the property, the money, the recognition, the justice, everything." William sat beside his daughter and hugged her. "And how are you feeling?" "Strange," admitted Rebecca. "For 45 years I was one person. Now suddenly I'm another. I have a different name, a different history, a different future." "Rebecca, you are still the same person you've always been," said William wisely. "Money and property don't change who you are inside. You are still my daughter, the kind and courageous woman your mother and I raised." "Dad, you're right," she replied, smiling for the first time since she had received the news. "And I know exactly what to do with this inheritance." 2 months later, Rebecca was at the Blackwell property for the first time since she had fled from there in 1982. The main house had been abandoned for years, with the garden overgrown with weeds and the paint peeling from the walls. David and Catherine had traveled from New York City to accompany Rebecca in this important moment. William was also present, along with Mayor Richard Hamilton and several people from the Riverbend community who had volunteered to help with the shelter project. "Rebecca, can you remember anything about this house?" asked David as they walked through the empty rooms. "A few things are coming back," she replied, stopping in front of the door to what had been her favorite room as a child. "I remembered that I used to play here near the window, where the most sunlight came in." "And the basement?" asked Catherine hesitantly. "Do you want to see it?" Rebecca took a deep breath and nodded. They went down the wooden stairs that creaked with every step. The basement was dark and damp, exactly as she remembered it from her childhood nightmares. "It was here," she said, pointing to a corner where chains were still attached to the wall. "This is where he would lock me up when he was drunk." William approached his daughter and hugged her. "Rebecca, this place will never see suffering again," he promised. "We are going to transform all of this." "Dad, I want to demolish this basement completely," said Rebecca with determination. "In its place we will build a playroom full of light and color." Mayor Richard Hamilton showed the blueprints he had commissioned for the property's renovation. "Rebecca, we managed to get the project approved at City Hall in record time," he said enthusiastically. "The house will be completely adapted to function as a shelter. We will have dormitories for 20 children, a study room, a library, a dining hall, an infirmary, and a recreation area. And the outside? We will build a sports court, a playground and a vegetable garden where the children can learn about farming," explained Richard. "William has volunteered to teach planting techniques and animal husbandry." Rebecca looked at her father affectionately. "Dad, you don't have to work anymore," she said. "With the inheritance, I can easily support you." "Rebecca, work isn't just about money," replied William, smiling. "It's about purpose. And what better purpose than to help children who have gone through what you went through?" David approached the group. "Rebecca, I managed to convince 5 of my doctor colleagues from New York City to volunteer for regular checkups at the shelter, he announced. We will have a pediatrician, a psychologist, a dentist, and a nutritionist visiting the children monthly. David, that's wonderful, replied Rebecca, moved. How can I thank you for so much help? You don't need to thank me, he said simply. We're family. That's what families do for each other. The renovation of the Blackwell property took 8 months to complete. Rebecca hired local workers and used materials from the region, ensuring the project benefited the entire Riverbend economy. During the renovation, she lived at Williams Farm and spent her days supervising the work. Every wall torn down, every renovated room, every dark corner transformed into a bright space, represented a victory over the traumatic past. Mrs. Patterson offered to work as the shelter's cook, saying it was her way of making up for not reporting the mistreatment at the time. Several other people from the town also volunteered for different roles. Catherine moved temporarily from New York City to help Rebecca organize the final details of the project. The two developed a very close relationship, and Rebecca finally understood what it was like to have a truly protective maternal figure. Rebecca, did you know you have a natural talent for caring for children? Commented Catherine one afternoon, after watching Rebecca interact with some local boys who came to help with the construction. I think it's because I know exactly how they feel when they're scared, replied Rebecca. I know what they need to hear to feel safe. The day of the Grace Haven inauguration, a name chosen in honor of Rebecca's adoptive mother, was an event that mobilized the entire region. Journalists from various cities came to cover the story, and more than 300 people attended the ceremony. William, now 73 years old, insisted on cutting the inaugural ribbon together with Rebecca. Folks, a year ago I was considered the crazy old man who dragged a safe around town, he said, provoking laughter from the crowd. Today I'm here inaugurating a place that will change the lives of many children. This proves that the truth always finds a way. Rebecca, emotional, addressed the crowd. When I was little and suffered mistreatment on this very property, I never imagined that one day I would return here to transform this place into a symbol of love and protection, she said, her voice choked with emotion. This shelter exists thanks to the man who saved me 40 years ago, William Thompson, and the woman who taught me what unconditional love is, Grace Thompson. The first child to be welcomed at Grace Haven was Lily, a 7-year-old girl who had been found abandoned in a neighboring town. When Rebecca received her at the shelter's door, she had the feeling that she was closing a cycle of pain and opening a new cycle of hope. Lily, welcome to your new home, said Rebecca, kneeling down to be at the girl's eye level. Here you will be treated with lots of love and care. Aunt Rebecca, can I play on the toys? Asked Lily shyly, pointing to the playground that had been built on the site of the old Blackwell garden. Of course you can, my dear, replied Rebecca, taking the girl's hand. You can play as much as you like. This place is yours now. As she watched Lily run towards the toys, Rebecca felt William's presence by her side. Dad, I think I finally understood why Mrs. Grace asked you to open that safe in front of everyone, she said with a smile. And what was the reason? Because secrets kept out of love can liberate not just one person, but an entire community, replied Rebecca, watching the children playing in the shelter's yard. She knew that my story could inspire other people to act with courage and justice. Your mother was always wiser than me, said William, smiling. She knew you had a greater purpose in life. 6 months after the inauguration, Grace Haven had already welcomed 15 children and had become a regional reference in caring for minors in vulnerable situations. David visited monthly to provide medical care. Catherine had moved permanently to Riverbend to help with administration. And William spent his days teaching the children about farming and raising animals. One afternoon, Rebecca received an unexpected visit. It was the social worker from the state capital who brought a proposal from the state government. Rebecca, your work here has become an example for the whole state, said the official. The government wants to replicate the Grace Haven model in other cities. How so? We want to create a network of shelters based on the same concept, transforming abandoned properties into safe homes for children, explained the social worker, and we would like you to coordinate this project. Rebecca spent a few minutes thinking about the proposal. "It would be an opportunity to help many more children," she said finally. "But I don't want to move away from here. This place is my home. These children are my family." "You wouldn't need to move away," clarified the official. "It would be more of a consulting role, helping other groups implement similar projects. The work would still be primarily here." Rebecca accepted the proposal, and in the following months she helped create 5 new shelters in different regions of the state. Each one transformed a property with a traumatic history into a place of welcome and hope. In December, on the first anniversary of the opening of Grace Haven, Rebecca organized a special party. All the children who had stayed at the shelter were invited, along with their new adoptive families or biological families that had been restructured. Lily, the first girl taken in, had been adopted by a couple from the city and returned for the party, radiant with happiness. "Aunt Rebecca, thank you for giving me a family," she said, hugging Rebecca tightly. "Lily, my dear, you're the one who gave a family to me," replied Rebecca, moved. During the party, William Thompson approached Rebecca with an envelope in his hand. "Daughter, I have a surprise for you," he said, handing her the envelope. Rebecca opened it and found a new birth certificate which read, "Emily Blackwell Thompson." "Dad, what is this?" "I asked Dr. Johnson to get your documentation in order," explained William. "Now you are officially Emily Blackwell Thompson. You kept your birth name, but you carry our last name too." "Dad, this is the most beautiful gift I could ever receive," said Rebecca, hugging William with tears of joy in her eyes. "You deserve to carry both names," he said. "Emily Blackwell, the brave girl who fled from suffering. Rebecca, the strong woman who transformed trauma into love. And Thompson, because you will always be our daughter." The party continued late into the night, with the children playing in the lit courtyard, and the adults talking about the shelter's future plans. David announced that he had secured full scholarships for 3 of the shelter's oldest children, and Catherine revealed that she had received donations from New York City business owners to expand the project. When everyone had left and the children were asleep, Rebecca and William sat on the porch of the old Blackwell house, now completely transformed into a home full of love. "Dad, do you regret anything?" asked Rebecca, looking at the stars in the sky. "What?" "Keeping the secret for 40 years, facing the town's criticism, risking everything to reveal the truth." William was silent for a few minutes, thinking of his answer. "Rebecca, if I could go back in time, I would do everything exactly the same," he said finally. "I would save you on that road, raise you with all the love I had to give, keep every piece of evidence to prove your identity, and open that safe in front of the whole town as many times as necessary." "Why?" "Because true love isn't about ease," replied William wisely. "It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. It's about protecting those we love, even when it costs us sacrifices. It's about turning pain into hope." Rebecca held her father's hand, and they sat in contemplative silence for a few minutes. "Dad, do you think Mrs. Grace would be proud of what we've accomplished?" "Daughter, I'm sure she's looking down on us from heaven and smiling," replied William. "She always knew you had a special destiny. That's why she made me promise that one day I would tell you the whole truth. And now that we've kept the promise, now we live in peace knowing we made a difference in the lives of many children," said William, rising from his chair, "and we continue to do so, one day at a time." End of story. So, what did you think of this story of overcoming and true love? Tell us in the comments where you're following us from. Did William do the right thing by keeping the secret for so long to protect Rebecca? Leave your honest opinion below. If you liked it, don't forget to like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other touching stories like this one.